Chapter 6. Until now, we spoke about the godly soul, its characteristics, and its garments. God created everything in a balance, one thing opposite the other. Now we're going to talk about the animal soul, its garments, and its character traits. Key. Just as the godly soul is made up of 10 character traits that are clothed in 10 holy garments, so too the animal soul, that's from the unholiness, called klipas nega, which is clothed in the blood of the person, is made of 10 crowns of impurity, 10 impure character traits. What are the 10 character traits? Those are 7 negative emotions, which we described earlier as coming from the 4 fundamental elements of the created world. And the intellectual faculties, 3, that give birth to these negative emotions, which are chachma bin adas, the root of the midas. Ki hamidas, because emotions are always in conjunction with, or they are commensurate to the intelligence and the maturity of the person. An immature person, a small person, wants unimportant things, because he's not mature enough. His mind is not expansive enough to understand the value of more important things. He also loses his temper over small and insignificant things. The same is true. He's very arrogant over unimportant things and all other negative character traits. That's an immature person. And the same is true about all the character traits. These 10 impure character traits. So when a person thinks them or speaks of them or acts upon them, then his thought, his speech, his action become vehicles for these 10 unholy character traits. Because the unholy character traits are clothed in your thought, your speech, or your action when you think, speak, or act inappropriately. The same is true about every activity under the sun. If you are doing something holy, your thought, speech, action become a vehicle for holy character traits of the godly soul. And if you're doing the opposite of holiness, then your thought, speech, action become vehicles for the unholy character traits of the animal soul. Everything under the sun that's not holy is really vanity and an affliction of the spirit. They ruin the spirit, says Kabbalah. All words and thoughts that are not directed to the service of Hashem, they are also garments for the animal soul and in its impurity. That's the definition of the other side, the opposition. It's the side that's not holy. Anything that's not holy, it's impure, it's unholy, becomes a vehicle for the unholiness and the 10 characteristics of your animal soul. What is the definition of holy? Holiness can only be a place of dwelling for Hashem. And Hashem cannot come to rest except in something that is nullified to him, that's humbled to him, whether actually humbled like angels or potentially humbled like the soul of every Jew. That means he has the innate, every Jew has the innate ability to sacrifice themselves, lay down their lives and be completely given over, surrendered to Hashem in case of emergency. And we've seen that throughout history, that Jews that have no obvious sense of humility before Hashem, but when push comes to shove, they prefer to be pushed and shoved than to give up on Hashem. That's called being humble to Hashem in potential. That's where our sages have said that even a single person who sits and studies Torah, the divine presence is upon him because he's made his thought, speech, and action a vehicle for holiness. He is nullified, he's humbled his thought, speech, and action. Also, each gathering of 10 Jews, the divine presence is always there because 10 Jews together form a group, a congregation of people who in potential are humbled before Hashem, and it doesn't matter what they're doing. But anything that's not humbled before Hashem, rather views itself as something separate from Hashem, will not receive light from Hashem himself, in a manner that holiness will be obvious and present and revealed in that thing. Where Hashem's presence, Hashem's own presence is felt in that thing. Rather in a concealed state from the hinder part. In other words, that means life has to come from Hashem, but it will descend degree after degree, level after level. In a manner of cause and effect, infinitely diminished at every stage. And in addition to that, it's contracted and contracted until the light that comes from Hashem is so terribly diminished, level after level, until it can actually be so contracted that it will enter into a state of exile in the body of that thing that considers itself separate from Hashem, to create it and to sustain its completely dependent existence. This existence, every existence depends completely on Hashem, and this light also comes from Hashem, and yet it's possible a thing should live from Hashem, and that life from Hashem should be so concealed and so diminished that the one who lives from that light should not even know it. Something that is not receiving life from Hashem will revert to nothingness the way it was before Hashem created. That's why this world and everything in it is called a world of klipa. Klipa means the shell that conceals godliness, the sitra achra, and opposition. Opposition means it rejects the notion that it lives from Hashem. It rejects the notion that it has to be humbled before Hashem. That's why everything in this world is so evil and so severe, and the wicked ones are successful, as described at length in Kabbalah. Note, even though, how could this world is evil and wicked, even though you find inside this world the 10 holy attributes of the divine light as it rests in the lowest of the four worlds, Asiya, as described in Kabbalah. In the 10 divine attributes that are in the lowest level is clothed the 10 divine attributes of the second lowest level, and in those is clothed the 10 divine attributes of the second to highest level, and in those is clothed the 10 holy attributes of the highest level, in which is clothed the infinite light of Hashem himself. That means that this whole world is infused with the light of Hashem himself, by way of Hashem's light being clothed in the 10 divine attributes of every level. And so the divine light of Hashem is clothed in the 10 attributes of Atzilus, which is clothed in the 10 attributes of Bria, which is clothed in the 10 attributes of Yetzirah, which is clothed in the 10 attributes of Asiya, which is clothed in this physical world. So the divine light of Hashem is here. It's just extremely clothed and closed off in a manner of exile. As described at length in Kabbalah. We have to remember now, we're going to get a definition of the various levels of impurity. Impurity is divided into two general categories. You have, and in this parak we'll focus mostly on the most difficult klipa, the most difficult impurity, and the next chapter will focus on the lighter version. The lowest level is 3 completely unclean and impure klipos, the ein bahem toiv klal. There's no goodness in them whatsoever. The holy spark of Hashem is so completely concealed, you don't find any goodness expressed in these unholinesses at all. We find them mentioned in the prophecy of Yecheskel regarding the great chariot of Hashem, described as a great cloud and a storm wind, etc. From these holy with a W, holy, which means completely impure klipos. You have nimshachas nafshis kulam esolim kim gufam. you have the souls and the life force and the sustenance of the bodies of all of those nations of the world who derive their sustenance from them, with the exception of what is known in halacha as the righteous among the nations, as well as the life and sustenance of all unkosher animals, as well as the existence and the sustenance of any vegetable that is not kosher to eat. For example, fruit on a tree before its fourth year, and fruits and vegetables that are a product of a forbidden mixture. Their life comes from these absolutely impure, dark, and unholy klipos, which is why we are not allowed to engage them by eating them. This is the important part. The life of a person at the moment that they think, speak, or act in a manner that is prohibited by Torah, their life comes from the completely impure and unholy klipos, as described there in Kabbalah. That's chapter 6. Chapter 7. What is the other kind of klipa? However, unlike the completely unholy klipa that we described in chapter 6, there is a second, more delicate form of unholiness from which the physical life, the animal soul of a Jew and the righteous among the nations comes from, which is clothed in the body of these human beings, Jews and the righteous among the nations, but not only humans, also the souls of the animals, the chayas and the wild beasts, v'efes and the birds, v'dagim, tehirim and the kosher fish. All foods, all animals that are pure, that we're allowed to eat them, matarim la'achilo, they are sustained through, by Hashem, of course, but through this more delicate klipa, v'kiyum v'chayas kol hademim v'chol hatzemeach hamorta b'achila, as well as any mineral material or any vegetable or anything that grows that is permitted to eat according to Torah, as well as the life force of the thought, speech, and action of the person when he's doing something that has no aspect that is forbidden by Torah, whether absolutely clean of any side, any hint of a prohibited act, whether the prohibition is biblical or rabbinical, then if it's not prohibited, what is it? It's an activity that is not for the sake of heaven. That's called parav halachically. It's called rishus. It's a permitted activity. It's not for the sake of God, and it's not prohibited. It's just the pursuit of the body's desires in a permitted manner. Another example would be if you are doing something that in fact you need in order to survive, but you don't have in mind that you're surviving and you're living in order to serve Hashem. The truth is, if a person is pursuing his health or her health, or they're pursuing simple delight that's permitted by Torah, these activities all are no better than the actual animal soul itself and the delicate klipa that is sustaining it. All of this, kosher animals, beasts, birds, vegetables, minerals, and permitted activities according to Torah, they all are sustained and their life comes from and flows from the second level of unholiness and opposition, shehi, which is called klipa, which is klipa revius, a fourth level of unholiness. Remember, there are three completely impure, and then there is one, and then there's a fourth, hanikras klipas noiga, which is called klipa that shines. Or in some versions it says klipa that has a dim light, klipas noiga, and we'll call it klipas noiga from now on. In this world, the world of action, most of this world is detached from Hashem and therefore in the category of evil, meaning unholy, not bad, just unholy. But throughout this world, goodness is mixed into everything. That's what happened at the tree of knowledge. Good and evil were mixed together, so everything is a blend. And most of the world lives and exists in that manner, a blend of goodness in an overwhelming mixture of the opposite of goodness. From this klipa called klipas nega, which has a dim light shining through it of holiness and goodness, from it come the good qualities which are found in the souls of the Jewish people as a rule, and those righteous among the nations as well, as we explained earlier in chapter 1. What's the function? Its role is to be the bridge between the absolutely impure and the realm of holiness. It finds itself between the two categories. It is not absolutely unholy, and it's certainly not pure holiness. It's explained in Kabbalah, sometimes this klipa, called klipas noiga, the klipa with a dim light shining through, can become included in holiness. I reversed it. Sometimes it can, by human activity, sink and become part of the absolute unholiness, and sometimes it can be elevated and become subsumed, absorbed into the realm of holiness. Dahainu, how does that happen? When through human activity we separate, we extract the holiness that's found inside the evil of klipas nega, the goyver v'olev nichlal b'kedusha, and we give it strength. We cause it to prevail over the unholiness and to become absorbed in holiness. Kagoin, for example, derech mashal, ha'echel bisra shmina detura v'sheisa yayin mevusam. A person might, quote unquote, indulge in food and drink, like, for example, fatty meats or delicious wine. But his intention in those activities is to broaden his mind and his heart for the study of Torah. As an example from the Gemara, Rava said that wine and fragrance make the mind more receptive. For example, you're eating delicious meat and drinking delicious wine in order to celebrate and to obey the command to delight on Shabbos and Yom Tov. You've used meat and wine for a mitzvah. Then the life force of that meat and wine, which flows from this fourth klipa, the klipa that has this dim light of holiness in it, called klipas nega, that life force, the spark of goodness in it, will be extracted. The oil of Hashem will ascend to God like a sacrifice on the holy altar. Sometimes, there's an activity that's borderline forbidden, and that's called frivolity, joking around. But if you joke around for the sake of learning and for the sake of serving Hashem, you can elevate the spark of holiness that animates that activity. In the Rebbe's words, so to a person who makes a humorous remark, to open the hearts and minds and to sharpen the hearts and minds of the students, and the Chachamim in the Gemara used to do. Rava is one example of a rabbi who used to do that for his students. He used to give them a riddle. He would give them a humorous remark or a riddle and make them cheerful, and then afterwards they would be able to learn better because they'd be in a good mood. And you have to also, for the service of Hashem, you have to be besimcha, you have to be in a good mood. Ivdu es Hashem besimcha, serve Hashem in a good mood. The service of Hashem is only possible when you are in a good mood. If you're using jokes and levity in order to lighten the mood and make everybody more susceptible to Torah study and more available for the service of Hashem, then you've elevated the spark of holiness that is in that klipas noiga life force. On the other hand, a person who indulges in wine and meat, same activity, but he's doing it in order to satisfy his bodily desires, which we explained in the first chapter, is the result of the element of water that is the pleasure seeker, because water is the source of all pleasure. But that person will have caused the life force, the holy spark, the life force of the klipas noiga, together with the holy spark that's in him, to descend, to sink, and for the time being, it will be captured and absorbed in the absolute unclean and unholy klipos. And then what happens? His body or her body becomes a chariot for those unholy forces. Of course, this is only temporary, until the person will return to Hashem, do tshuva, and invest in the service of Hashem and in the Torah study. The question is, why is it so easy to rescue this life force of Klipas Noiga and the holy spark that was in it? You just did something that was unholy. How can you save it so easily? No problem. There was no actual prohibition transgressed there. It was just that you were self-indulgent. That's not prohibited according to Torah. It's certainly not holy, though. So therefore, what you have to do is you have to take the energy. You have to take the energy from that food and that drink and use it to serve Hashem. Since the meat was kosher and the wine was kosher, therefore the meat and the wine are able to ascend together with him or her when they return to the service of Hashem. That's actually the definition of the biblical way of saying that something is permitted. Heter and mutar means permitted or permissibility, but it doesn't translate exactly so. Heter and mutar means unbound or released, which means even something that might be unholy, it's not attached to the forces of unholiness. It may be held by them temporarily, but it's not bound to them in a manner that would prevent it from returning and ascending to Hashem. But we have to remember that nevertheless, even when you have returned the energy that was in the meat and wine to the service of Hashem, because you turned your own activities to the service of Hashem, you have to remember that a trace of that self-indulgence, which is unholy, will remain on the body of the person. And therefore, before this soul can receive its final judgment in the afterworld, it will have to go through the purging in the grave, as will be explained later. Similarly, if a person expresses seed in a manner that is self-indulgent, that means that he was together with his wife not in order to fulfill the mitzvah in a pure manner, or he was with his wife in a time of her impurity, which is forbidden, then what does he have to do? He temporarily, that life force that is in that generally permitted activity, but in this case he did it in a forbidden way, is also temporarily caught in the forces of absolute unholiness. But it's able through tshuva to release them and bring them back up to holiness. However, there are cases such as forbidden foods, that means treif, or illicit relations, that means being with somebody Torah forbids you to be with, immediate, a married lady, or immediate family members, which in that case, those prohibited acts derive their vitality from the absolutely, entirely unclean klipos. Those activities and the energy that is put into them, asurim ukshurim midei. We don't call those mutar or heter, unbound or released. Those are bound up, tied, forever attached to the extraneous forces of unholiness in the world. There's nothing a human being can do to redeem them. They will stay there until Hashem himself, with the coming of Mashiach, will destroy the forces of evil forever. The spirit of unholiness I must remove from the world, says Hashem. That's one option. There's one thing a human being can do. A person can achieve such a tremendous, intense level of tshuva that his sins become merits for him. And we'll discuss this later in Tanya. What kind of tshuva is that? Shehi tshuva mi'ahva mi'umka de liba. That's a tshuva that is the product of such a tremendous, deep-seated love for Hashem in the depths of the heart of the person, bi'ahava, with a love, yearning, the chashika, and a fervor, b'nefesh shekeika, and a passionate soul, ledavka b'yisbarich, yearning to cleave to Hashem. Where the soul is thirsting for Hashem like a person in a barren, arid desert thirsts for water, knowing, to the degree where you feel that your life depends on it. How does that come? How does that attitude overtake a person? You realize that until now, because you've been self-indulgent and involved in prohibited activities, you realize that you have been in a world, you have been in a spiritually barren and arid world. Meaning you've been in the world of the opposition of holiness. And you have been infinitely distant, utterly distant from the presence of Hashem. And therefore, your soul will yearn and thirst for closeness to Hashem more intensely even than the souls of the righteous. Why? Because they've never experienced desperate thirst for godliness. They've always been quenched, so to speak. Perhaps they want a more intense version of their spiritual satisfaction, but they've never been on the brink of spiritual death. And that's why the sages say, in the place where the penitent stands, the perfectly righteous cannot stand. They've never experienced that desperation. It's only on such a tremendous yearning and love and desperation for Hashem that will produce such a transformation in the person that even his sins will become like mitzvahs, will be transformed so utterly. Why? Because it's exactly his transgressions that caused this tremendous love. It's because he sinned that he was so far from God, and because he was so far from God due to those sins, that's why he has this desperate love and yearning. But if a person will only do a general tshuva, not from such a deep, passionate, desperate love for Hashem, even though it's appropriate tshuva, Hashem will forgive his sins, those terrible activities that he was involved in, the forbidden activities that are forever bound to the forces of unholiness, they will not be transformed. They will remain on his credit as damage, even though Hashem will forgive him and not punish him in this world. They will not be they will not be released from the unholiness until the time that Hashem himself will destroy evil forever. By contrast, seed expressed for no reason, even though they descend and they are included and grabbed by the three completely impure unholinesses. The Arizal says that you can release them and redeem them by having a proper kavanah during the bedtime Kriyat Shema, and by doing a proper tshuva, meaning committing never to do that again. This has been alluded to in the Gemara when it says, a person who recites the bedtime Shema with the right kind of kavana, it's as though he holds a double-edged sword. Why double-edged? For the one edge is used to slay the bodies of the unholy forces that have come into being as a product of the seed that he expressed for no reason, and to release the spirit of life that belongs to holiness but was captured in their hands, as is known to those that are familiar with Kabbalah. Therefore, here we see there's a difference between the the wasteful expression of seed, the difference between the wasteful expression of seed and the forbidden relations in Torah. They're not listed in the same category because the spiritual result of those two sins is different. Af shechomer mehen, although expressing seed for no reason is a worse crime, it's a worse sin, and it causes in one way deeper damage. Begadol avoinoi, it's a greater sin b'vchinas hagadlus, in its terrible impact. V'riboy hatumon v'haklipes shemoilid, umar b'mimoid me'od b'atzara zelavatol yesem b'asasuris. And why is it worse? Why is it more terrible? Because it produces more forces of unholiness, and it promulgates impurity far, far more than the forbidden relations. Yet it doesn't belong in that category because it's not so tangible to this world as is a forbidden relation. And this is the reason. When a person engages another person in a forbidden relation, he actually adds life to the unholiness, not just he promulgates the number of unholy forces, he actually strengthens the whole force of unholiness in the world, to a degree where he cannot ever redeem or release the life force that was invested in the unholiness because of that act. Unless he can muster up such a tremendous tshuva, like we described, that tshuva from desperate love. Why? Because when a person is engaged with another person, and then the seed is invested in a vessel, it's not just spilled on the ground with no vessel receiving it, then the spiritual result is that the life expressed from the soul, when the human being expressed the seed from his body, is received by somebody. If it was spilled on the floor and it was not received by anybody, then spiritually there's also no recipient, so it's easily redeemed. But if there is a quote-unquote female, meaning a recipient, involved in that illicit relation, then spiritually there's also a recipient. That is the forces of unholiness, and that means that the soul of the person who has engaged in that illicit relationship is delivering life force and increasing the life of the unholiness, because there is now somebody receiving from the side of unholiness. That's not the case if the seed was spilled on the floor and there's no recipient. Then spiritually as well, the soul will have released life force into the realm of unholiness, but it's not received permanently. Only that the klippa's power and forces garb in an encompassing way. They surround the life force expressed in that act, but they cannot actually vest it within themselves and take ownership of it, as is known to those who are familiar with Kabbalah. Now we can understand another teaching of Chazal. What kind of sin is the one referred to that as a fault that cannot be corrected? A person who had an illicit relation and gave birth to a mamzer. Because now there's a permanent remnants, there's a permanent evidence, there's a permanent product of that sinful behavior, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Even if a person will do such a tremendous tshuva that technically his sins should become his mitzvahs, he cannot release that life force and bring it back to the side of holiness, because that life force has been invested in unholiness, and has been translated into a physical human being in this world. That cannot be fixed. Chapter 8, but there's another thing to worry about, and that is, we gave the example of a human being who embodies absolutely impure and unholy life force, namely a child who unfortunately comes from an illicit relationship. There's another manner in which absolute unholiness becomes part of a human being. And that is something we have to take very seriously. The same is true about forbidden foods. Shelakach nekreim b'shem isur. That's why they are called isur, meaning bound or attached, shackled. Even if a person ate unknowingly non-kosher food, and he ate it l'shem shamayim, he did it with divine intent. His intention was that he was going to serve Hashem with the strength of that cheeseburger. The gam poal v'yasaken, and in fact he did. He davened beautifully and he learned beautifully. The karav yispal b'kach achilahi. Ein hachayish shaba ilo mislabish b'tevus atei v'atfil k'mei ha'heter. The life force contained in that food cannot be elevated and cannot become invested in the words of Torah and prayer that he said, as would the life force in permitted food. Because of its bondage to the absolutely impure and unholy klippas. Even if the prohibition against that food is rabbinic in nature, which the Torah elevates a rabbinical prohibition even higher than a biblical prohibition. And therefore, by the way, it's important to note that since the soul of a Jew is from the tempered unholiness called klipas nega, tempered unholiness desires tempered unholiness. Tempered unholiness does not desire absolute impurity. It's not in its nature. Makes sense? And therefore, gam hayetzer hara v'keach ha'mesav ledvarim ha'asurim, the evil inclination, if a person feels himself inclined or desiring something that's absolutely forbidden, hushed mished nuchrayim, it's a demon from a foreign world. That's not a Jewish yetzer hara. That's not your own desire. That's a demon that has entered your mind and your heart that doesn't belong to you. Shehu yetzer hara shalom esolim. That is a inclination that belongs to the nations of the world who are permitted to eat those things. Their souls are from those absolutely impure klippas, and therefore their desires are for those absolutely impure klippas, but not a Jewish soul. Whereas the inclination and the yearning, the desire to indulge in permitted things, that is really a Jewish yetzer hara. The urge for pastrami with a nice, properly prepared dill pickle, that's a Jewish yetzer hara. Yeah, schmaltz heading with kichel, that's a Jewish yetzer hara. A cheeseburger, a Jew doesn't want that. Why? Because those things, the soul of the Jew wants to do its job. It wants to have fun along the way, but it wants to do its job. It doesn't want to get cut off from the source of life. And therefore it desires things that can be redeemed. It doesn't desire things that it cannot help, that it cannot influence. Yeah. So therefore, a Jewish heart will yearn for and desire pastrami on rye, and it will be purely self-indulgent. And the result of that self-indulgence is that the life force inside of that food will be captured in the absolute unholy klippa. And after the person will use that energy to serve Hashem and to daven properly, there will be a remnant of that unholiness on the body of the person that has to be purged before it can stand before the heavenly court. The reason for that is that's because, like in the example, similar but not exactly so, similar to the example of the human soul derived from absolute unholiness due to the illicit relation that becomes a human being that cannot be fixed in this lifetime, food becomes part of your body, and that can't really be fixed in this lifetime if that food is prohibited. And therefore the body needs to go through the purging in the grave, to cleanse it, and to purify it, from its impurity, that it received from its various delights in this world, that are the result of the tempered unholiness called klipas nega and the Jewish demons, meaning the desire for pastrami. The exception will be a person who never derived any delight from physical things. The only example, or one example, that we have in the Talmud is Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbeinu HaKodesh, who at the time of his demise, he said, when he passed away, he said, I never derived pleasure even from the size of a pinky for this world. Okay. What about innocent schmoozing? Like, for example, a person who is in a situation where he cannot use the time to study Torah or to daven. He doesn't know how, or the situation makes it impossible. And so he's schmoozing innocently. He's not saying lashon hara chas v'shalom. He's not using foul language chas v'shalom. He's not describing unholy things, God forbid. He's just schmoozing about the weather. The soul must be cleansed from that impurity through kaf hakela, which is the hollow of a sling. It's a terrible experience that the soul goes through before it can stand before the heavenly court. As described in Kabbalah. And then when that's done, it will go and stand trial and be judged, hopefully righteous, and go to Gan Eden. Aval le-diburim misurim, but when it comes to forbidden speech, like scoffing or slander, God forbid, those are rooted in the absolute forces of unholiness. This kafakela is not enough to remove that unholiness and impurity from the soul. Instead, the soul will have to, when it stands judgment in the heavenly court, it will be sent to Gehenna to clean that damage off of it. Similarly, a person who has the ability to study Torah and instead is schmoozing, the hollow of the sling before the judgment is not enough. Rather, it must receive the severe penalties which are delivered to those who neglect Torah study specifically. In addition to the general punishment for those that neglect mitzvahs in the Gehenna of snow, as explained elsewhere. Similarly, occupying yourself in the secular wisdom is included in the sin of wasting time of Torah study, as described in the laws of Torah study. In addition to that, it's important to note that the impurity of the wisdom of the nations has more impurity in it than just idle talk. Why? Because idle talk, you're only putting your outer garment in it, and your emotion, the garment of speech in it, and the emotions in it. By tainting them with you're only touching your godly emotions and the godly faculty of speech by investing them instead in idle, empty words. But you're not investing your intelligence in it, because idle chatter is about nothing. It's emptiness and it's foolishness. You don't have to be particularly intelligent to engage in that kind of schmoozing. Whereas a person that's studying sciences and the wisdom of the nations, he's actually clothing his intellectual soul in it, and the intellectual faculties of his godly soul and his godly faculty of thought in the impurity of klipas nega, that's found in those disciplines, where where holiness has fallen in the event of the shattering of the vessels, which we'll learn about later, and it arrived there in a manner of back-to-back delivery, unwilling delivery of life, as all of unholiness gets its life from Hashem in an unwilling manner, like over the shoulder, like I don't really want to give you, but I have to, so here you go. These ideas are familiar to those who have studied Kabbalah, and we find ourselves among them, but we'll get into it at a later time. The exception is if you're using these sciences and those disciplines as a useful instrument. Like if you're studying the sciences in order to earn a living so that later you could serve Hashem. Or if you're an expert in Torah and you know how to use the sciences to advance your Torah knowledge, like the Rambam, or you know how to use the sciences to further your Avodas Hashem directly, like the Rebbe, then studying the sciences and the liberal arts becomes part of your Avodas Hashem, part of your service of Hashem, and then you're not tainted by the unholiness that's there. And that is the reasoning of Maimonides and Nachmanides and others of their ilk, holy and grand ilk, who have the permission to study those sciences. That's the end of chapter 8. Wow. What did we learn here? We learned the entire definition of unholiness. We see the entire gamut. We see the entire spectrum of unholiness, how we interact with it on a regular basis, how we should avoid it, what should we do if we slipped and fell. That is what we learned from chapter 6 through 8. At this point, we have covered chapters 1 through 8, which means the Alter Rebbe has introduced us to ourselves. We have a divine soul. We have a human soul. The divine soul is and wants godliness. The human soul is and wants indulgence, survival, pleasure. There's also evil that is around us, that doesn't belong to us. Those things are not kosher. Those things are prohibited by the Torah. We're not allowed to engage with them because they don't belong in our world. We are not related to those things. Therefore, even if we find ourselves desiring those things, we have to realize that that's like a dibuk. Not actually a dibuk. We shouldn't get afraid. We should realize that's not mine. Why am I struggling with this? It's not for me. I can dismiss it. I can walk away from it. It's not mine. When we come back after a while to continue reading the chapters quickly, we'll start at chapter 9, and the Alter Rebbe will describe to us the struggle that we have against the temptations of the world. And that's going to be fascinating as well. For now, we'll sign off from this project and we'll go back to the original project of studying the Tanya very, very carefully. Thanks for joining. Have a wonderful, wonderful week.